Good evening, everyone. The Lord be with you. Cell phones. Thank you very much. I think you'll agree that in this conference we've been very richly blessed by our visiting speakers from such different perspectives, and I'm completely confident that tonight will be no exception. It's a great privilege that we've been able to secure the attendance of Sir Jonathan Sacks, the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth. And for those who don't know, the one or two who might not know, Sir Jonathan is probably one of the most distinguished religious and political thinkers to be writing in the English language at the moment. The work that he has done on religion and society, on the contribution of faith to building a home to live in, to refer to his most recent work, has been quite unique. A writer of depth and clarity and imagination. Every time I've heard him speak, I've come away with something unforgettably vivid from the presentation. Like all good rabbis, he has a fund of narratives to fill out what he says, and that perhaps is one of the things that people will remember most clearly. But beneath it all and sustaining it all is a powerful, coherent vision of how faith can indeed build sustainable society. I'm very pleased indeed to welcome Sir Jonathan on your behalf and to invite him now to address us. There will be, as before, opportunity for questions afterwards. If you will write them down on slips of paper, they'll be collected and dealt with in the usual way. Sir Jonathan Sacks.
Your graces, beloved friends. I did actually say I wasn't going to tell any stories, but I'm about to break my promise because I never knew it was going to be quite this hot. And it does remind me of one of my favorite stories of all, about a really humid evening in the Lower East Side of New York, where there was a Jewish restaurant, and one of the rather unruly customers, feeling a little like you're feeling at this moment, called the waiter over and said, "Waiter, it's too hot in here, switch the air conditioning on." And the waiter went off. 10 minutes later, he calls the waiter back, "Waiter, it's now too cold in here, switch the air conditioning off." And the waiter goes out, and 10 minutes later, he calls him back and he says, "Waiter, it's now too hot in here, turn the air conditioning on again." And the waiter's just about to leave for a third time, and one of the customers near the door says, "Waiter, I feel so sorry for you. That man must be driving you mad." And the waiter replies, "No, actually I'm driving him mad. You see, there is no air conditioning." But friends, this is for me personally a profoundly moving moment. You have invited me, a Jew, to join your deliberations, and I thank you for that and for all that it implies. There's a lot of history between our two faiths, and for me to stand here counting as I do, His Grace the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York, as cherished and beloved colleagues, is, I believe, a signal of hope for our children and for our world. The sages of Judaism 2,000 years ago said, who is a hero? Not one who defeats an enemy, but one who turns an enemy into a friend. That is what has happened between Jews and Christians. Strangers have become friends. And so I think on this may be, I'm not sure, the first occasion that a rabbi has addressed a plenary session of the Lambeth conference. I want to thank God in the words of our traditional Jewish prayer, Shechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Thank you, God, for bringing us to this time. Friends, you've asked me to speak about covenant, and that's what I'm going to do. And we will discover in covenant not only a transformative idea, an idea that actually changes us even as we think of it, and it is not only the way forward for faith in the 21st century, but we will also find ourselves, when we think about covenant, better able to answer the question, what is the role of religion in society, even in a secular society like Britain today? And I want to just begin a little journey with the place we passed on that wonderful march we did together last Thursday in Westminster. It was such a beautiful day, was it not? A beautiful day. And it was such a lovely day that I kind of imagined meeting up with my little granddaughter on the way back and taking her to see some of the sights of London. And we'd begin where we were, the outside Parliament. And I imagine her asking, what happens there, Saba, Grandpa, what happens there? And I'd say, what happens there is politics. And she'd say, what's politics about? And I'd say it's about the creation and distribution of power. And then we'd go to the city and see the Bank of England, and she'd ask, what happens there? And I'd say, what happens there is economics. And she'd say, what's economics about? And I would say, economics is about the creation and distribution of wealth. And then on our way back, we'd pass St. Paul's Cathedral. And she'd ask, what happens there? And I'd say, what happens there is worship. And she'd ask, well, what does worship produce, create, and distribute? And that's a good question. Because, you see, for the past 50 years, our lives have been dominated by those two other institutions, politics and economics, the state and the market, the logic of power and the logic of wealth. The state is us in our collective capacity. The market is us as individuals. And the debate has been, for the past 50 years, which of the two is the more effective. The left tends to favor the state. The right tends to favor the market, and there are endless shadings in between. But that leaves out of the equation a third phenomenon of the utmost importance, and I want to explain why. The state is about power, the market is about wealth, and there are two ways of getting people to do what we want them to do. One of them is to force them to do it, the way of power. The other one is to pay them to do it, the way of wealth. But there's a third way. And to see exactly what makes the third way different from the other two, I just want to do a little elementary arithmetic with you, because elementary arithmetic is about as much as I can do. My pocket, even my mobile phone, gives me an inferiority complex, so your higher mathematics is not my style. But here it is. Imagine for a moment you have total power. And then in a fit of craziness, you decide to share it with 9 other people. How much power do you have left? You have 1/10 of what you began with. Supposing you have £1,000 and you decide to share it with 9 other people. How much do you have left? 1/10 of what you had when you began. But now, supposing you decided to share not power or wealth, but love, or friendship, or influence, or even knowledge, and you decided to share those with 9 others, how much would you have left? Would you have less than you began? No, you'll have more. And why is that? Because love and friendship and influence are the things that only exist by virtue of sharing them with others. And those are the goods I call covenantal goods. Covenantal goods are goods that the more I share, the more I have. And that makes covenant different from wealth and power. In the short term, wealth and power are zero-sum games. That means if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. But covenantal goods are non-zero-sum games, meaning we both win. The more I give away, the more I have, we both win. And that has huge consequences. Because you can see with wealth and power, with economics and politics, the market and the state, they cannot be other than arenas of competition. That's right, that's good. But covenantal goods are arenas of cooperation. And the question is, where will you find covenantal goods? Like love, like friendship, like trust, like influence. You won't find them in the state. You won't find them in the market. You will find them in marriages, in families, in congregations, in communities. You'll find them in society, so long as you remember that society is something different from the state. And that is one way of seeing what is key to covenant. You see, there are 2 words that sound as if they were almost the same, but they're actually very different. I mean the word contract and the word covenant. What's a contract? A contract is an agreement between 2 or more individuals, each pursuing their own interest, and they come together to make an exchange for mutual benefit. And so you get a commercial contract that creates the market, and you get the social contract that creates the state. A covenant is something different. In a covenant, 2 or more individuals, each respecting the dignity and the integrity of the other, come together in a bond of love and trust to share their interests. Sometimes even to share their lives by pledging our faithfulness to one another, to do together what neither of us can do alone. And that is not the same as a contract at all. A contract is a transaction, but a covenant is a relationship. Or to put it slightly differently, a contract is about interests, but a covenant is about identity. And that is why contracts benefit, but covenants transform. And there it is, as simply as I can put it, economics and politics are about the logic of competition. Covenant is about the logic of cooperation. And now I want to ask a very fundamental question. Why is it that societies cannot exist without cooperation? Why is it that state and market alone cannot sustain a society? And the answer to that is an absolutely fascinating story. And it begins with Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, if I understand him correctly, in his book, The Descent of Man, identified a problem that he could not solve. According to Darwin, if I understand him correctly, all life evolves by natural selection, which means by competition for scarce resources, food, shelter, and the like. If so, you would expect to find all societies valuing the most competitive, maybe even the most ruthless individuals. That is what you would expect in a Darwinian universe. But what Darwin himself noticed is that it isn't so. In fact, in every society of which he knew, it was the most altruistic individuals who were most highly valued, not the most competitive. Or if I can put it in the language of Richard Dawkins, the paradox is that a bundle of selfish genes get together to produce selfless people. That is the paradox. How does it happen? That paradox lay unresolved until the late 1970s. And it was then that three very different disciplines converged. One was sociobiology, another was a branch of mathematics called games theory, and a third was high-speed computer simulation. And they produced something called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. If you really want to stop a conversation, say the words iterated prisoner's dilemma, and they'll all start looking for the door. Anyway, to cut a long story short, what they discovered was this: that natural selection, yes, it works through the genes of individuals. But individuals, certainly in the higher life forms, survive only because they're part of groups. And groups only survive on the basis of reciprocity and trust, or what I have called covenant, the logic of cooperation. Without cooperation, no group. And you need a group to survive. One human being versus one lion, lion wins. 10 human beings against one lion, humans in with a chance. And it turns out that the very things that make Homo sapiens different, our use of language, the size of our brains, even the moral sense itself, all of these have to do with the ability to form and sustain groups. And this phenomenon is called by neo-Darwinians reciprocal altruism. Sociologists call it trust. Economists call it social capital. And it is one of the great intellectual discoveries of our time. Individuals need groups, groups need cooperation, and cooperation needs covenant, bonds of reciprocity and trust. Traditionally, that was, and I believe still is, the domain of religion. That is what religions create and distribute. The very word religion itself, as you know, comes from a Latin root meaning to bind people or things together. And everyone knew this. It's just they forgot it. Whether we take somebody conservative like Edmund Burke, or radical like Thomas Paine, or social scientific like Emile Durkheim, or simply insightful like Alexis de Tocqueville, they all saw it. And now it has been scientifically demonstrated. If you only have cooperation, competition, but not cooperation, if you only have the state and the market and not covenant, then society will not survive. What then happens to society when religion wanes and there is nothing covenantal to take its place? What happens is that relationships break down. Marriage grows weak. Families become fragile. Communities atrophy. And the result is that people feel vulnerable and alone. And they can turn those feelings outward, and the result is often anger, which, God forbid, can become violence. Or they can turn those feelings inward, and the result, God forbid, is depression, stress-related syndromes, eating disorders, and drug and alcohol abuse. What happens when religion wanes, when covenant wanes, is that you find spiritual poverty in the midst of material affluence. It doesn't happen all at once, but it happens slowly, gradually, inexorably. Societies without covenants and without the institutions needed to inspire and sustain them gradually disintegrate. And the result is a loss of freedom and a loss of the dimension of graciousness in our lives together. So that is where we are and where we're headed, God forbid. And now let's go back to where it all began, in the ancient Near East. You know, there in the ancient Near East, covenants existed in the form of treaties between tribes or states, and that had very little to do with religion. To the contrary, in the ancient world, religion was about politics and economics. Religion was about power and wealth. After all, the gods were the supreme powers. They were also the controllers of wealth in the form of rain and earth and harvests. So if you wanted power or you wanted wealth, you had to get the gods on your side. The idea that there could be a covenant between God and humanity must have seemed absurd. If you had told people that there could be between the infinite and the finite, between the eternal and ephemeral, a bond of love and trust, they'd say to you what my office often says to me, Chief Rabbi, go and lie down until the mood passes. And if you had gone further and said, God loves not the wealthy and the powerful, but the poor and the powerless, they would have thought you were mad. But that was the idea that transformed the world. Covenant is a key word of Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, where it occurs more than 250 times. No one put it more simply than the prophet Hosea in words Jewish men say every weekday morning when we start our prayers. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, love and compassion. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. That is covenant, a betrothal, a bond of love and trust. And the prophet Jeremiah, in the name of God, so beautifully spelled out the result in a line we read this Saturday in our synagogues. I remember the kindness of your youth, the love of your betrothal, how you were willing to follow me into the desert, into an unknown, unsown land. Covenant is what allows us to face the future without fear, because we know we are not alone. The purest line of covenant says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Covenant is the redemption of solitude. Now there are in the books of Genesis and Exodus 3 covenants. Number 1 in Genesis 9, the covenant with Noah, and through him all humanity. Number 2 in Genesis 17, God's covenant with Abraham. And number 3, Exodus chapters 19 to 24, God's covenant with the Israelites in the days of Moses. And none supersedes or replaces the others. And without going into detail, I want to look at one significant difference between them, between the Noah covenant and the Abrahamic and Sinai covenants. And to explain this difference, I have to use a distinction that we owe to a man whom I regard as the greatest Jewish thinker of the 20th century. His name may not be familiar to you. It was Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And I want to explain a distinction he made between 2 kinds of covenant. And the simplest way of approaching it is to ask you a very simple question. When, according to the Bible, did the Israelites become a nation? You will find in the Bible 2 apparently contradictory answers to that. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 26, in the declaration an Israelite had to make when bringing first fruits to the temple, he made a declaration. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, and there he became a nation. According to Deuteronomy 26, the Israelites became a nation in Egypt when they were slaves. And yet, of course, according to Exodus chapter 19, they only became a nation when they left Egypt and stood at the foot of Sinai and accepted a covenant with God to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So where did they become a nation? In Egypt, or only when they left? And Rabbi Soloveitchik said, in the rabbinical way, they are both true, but they involve different kinds of covenant. There is, he said, a covenant of fate, and there is a covenant of faith. And they are different things. A group can be bound in a covenant of fate when the members of that group suffer together, or they face a common enemy, they have shared tears, they have shared fears, they have shared responsibilities, they huddle together for comfort and for mutual protection. That is a covenant of fate. A covenant of faith is different. That is made by people who share dreams, aspirations, ideals. They don't need a common enemy because they have a common hope. And they come together to create something new. They're defined not by what happens to them by fate, but by what they commit themselves to do. That is a covenant of faith. And now we can immediately understand how the Israelites had not one foundational moment, but two. Number one in Egypt, and number two at Sinai. In Egypt, they became a nation bound by a covenant of fate. The fate of slavery and of suffering. But at Sinai, they became a nation bound by a covenant of faith, defined by the Torah and by its commands. And that distinction is vital to what I have to say today. Now, I puzzled about this. That distinction that Rabbi Soloveitchik made is so fundamental and it so obviously fits. How come nobody said it, or at least nobody said it that explicitly before in 4,000 years of Jewish history? How could that insight come about only in the lifetime of Rabbi Soloveitchik, by which in effect I mean after the 1940s? And the answer is obvious. It lies in one word: Holocaust. You see, at the level of faith, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Jews were deeply divided. But in the Holocaust, they shared the same fate. Orthodox and non-Orthodox, religious and secular, identifying and totally assimilated. And what Soloveitchik was doing within a deeply fragmented Jewish world was to rescue some sense of solidarity with the victims, a covenant of fate. As soon as we have made this distinction, we can state a proposition of the utmost importance. If you read Genesis and Exodus superficially, it looks as if the three covenants, on the one hand Noah, on the other hand Abraham, Moses and Sinai, they look as if they're the same kind of thing. But actually, if you think about it now, you will see they're not the same kind of thing at all. The covenant with Abraham and the covenant at Sinai were covenants of faith, about believing in the one God and keeping his laws. But if you look in Genesis 9, the covenant with Noah says not one word about faith. The world had been almost destroyed by a flood. All mankind, all life, excluding Noah's Ark, shared the same fate. Humanity after the flood was like the Jewish people after the Holocaust. The covenant of Noah was not a covenant of faith, but a covenant of fate. God says, I promise I will never again destroy the world, but I cannot promise that you will never destroy the world. Because you see, I gave you free will. All I can do is teach you how not to destroy the world. And how. The covenant of Noah, I think, has three essential dimensions. Number one, he who sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man, the sanctity of human life. Element two, look carefully at Genesis 9 and you will see no less than 5 times that one chapter emphasizes, insists, that the covenant God is making is not with Noah and humanity at all, but alone, but with everything that lives on the face of the earth. 5 times. It's a covenant not only with human beings, but with all of nature. So the second element of the covenant of Noah is the integrity of the created world, what we call today the environment. And number 3, the sign of the covenant, which is a rainbow. the white light of God, fragmented into all the colors of the spectrum. Or as I put it in the title of one of my books, the dignity of difference. The miracle of monotheism is that unity up there creates diversity down here. And those three elements, sanctity of human life, the integrity of the environment, and respect for diversity, are the three elements of the global covenant of fate that God made with Noah and still makes with us. You know, there's a famous prophecy in the 11th chapter of Isaiah, you know this as well as we do, that one day, the wolf will lie down with the lamb. I don't think it's happened yet, although I did hear about a zoo in Los Angeles where they have a cage where the wolf lies down with the lamb, and one visitor asked the zookeeper, how do you do that? And the zookeeper said, easy, you just needs a new lamb every day. But actually, friends, there was once when the wolf laid down with the lamb. Where was that? And the answer is in Noah's ark. And why did the wolf lie down with the lamb? Not because they liked one another, but because otherwise they would drown. That is the covenant of fate. That is the covenant, the global covenant of human solidarity. And you will note the covenant of fate precedes the covenant of faith, because faith is always particular, but fate is universal. And with that I come to the present. We are living through one of the most fateful ages of change since Homo sapiens first set foot on Earth. Globalization and the new information technologies are changing everything in our world in ways we cannot possibly predict. But we can say what they're doing already. They're doing two things simultaneously. Number one, they are fragmenting our world into ever smaller pieces, into ever smaller sects of the like-minded. And number two, in the opposite direction, globalization is thrusting us together as never before in all of history. The destruction of rainforests there adds to global warming everywhere. Political conflict in one place can create a terrorist incident thousands of miles away. Poverty there moves consciences here. At the very moment that covenants of faith are breaking apart, covenant of fate is forcing us together. And we have not yet proved equal to it. All three elements of the global covenant are in danger. The sanctity of human life is being ravaged by political oppression and by terror. The integrity of creation is being threatened by environmental catastrophe. And the respect for diversity is being imperiled by what one writer has called a clash of civilizations. And to repeat, the covenant of fate precedes the covenant of faith, because before we can live any faith, we have to be able to live. And we have to honor our covenant with future generations so that they will be able to live. And that is the call of God of our time. Friends, I stand before you as a Jew, which means not just as an individual, but as a representative of my people. And as I prepared this lecture, within my soul, there were the tears of my ancestors. We may have forgotten, but for 1,000 years, between the First Crusade and the Holocaust, the word Christian struck fear into Jewish hearts. I think of the words the Jewish encounter with Christianity added to the vocabulary of pain. Blood libel, disputation, forced conversion, inquisition, auto da fe, expulsion, ghetto, pogrom. And I could not stand here today in total openness and not mention that book of Jewish tears. And I have asked myself, what would our ancestors want of us today? And the answer to that lies in the scene that brings Genesis to a climax and a closure. You remember the scene. It happens after the death of Jacob. And the brothers fear that Joseph will take revenge. After all, they had sold him into slavery in Egypt. And instead, Joseph forgives. But he does much more than forgive. I want us to listen carefully to his words. He said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to do what is now being done, to save many lives." Joseph does more than forgive. He says, look, out of all that bad, good has come. It's allowed me to save many lives. And which lives was he referring to? He was certainly not referring to the lives of his brothers only. He was referring to the lives of the Egyptian strangers. And he says, look, I have been able to feed the hungry. I have been able to honor the covenant of fate. And by honoring the covenant of fate between him and strangers, Joseph was able to mend the broken covenant of faith between him and his brothers. In effect, Joseph says to his brothers, we cannot unwrite the past, but we can redeem the past if we take our tears and use them to sensitize us to the tears of others. And I want you now to see a remarkable thing. Just think carefully about the structure of the book of Genesis. Although Genesis is centrally about the covenant of faith between God and Abraham, nonetheless, it begins and ends with a covenant of fate. It begins the covenant in the days of Noah. It ends with Joseph. Look at the similarities and the differences. Both of these lives, both of these covenantal moments involve water. In the case of Noah, too much, a flood. In the case of Joseph, too little, a drought. Both involve saving human lives, but look at the difference. In human terms, Noah saves only his family. Joseph saves a whole nation. A nation of strangers, not his people. Both involve forgiveness. But in the story of Noah, it's God who forgives. In the story of Joseph, it's a human being who forgives. And both involve a relationship with the past. In the case of Noah, the past is obliterated. In the case of Joseph, the past is redeemed. In the case of Jews and Christians, that past is being redeemed. In 1942, in the midst of humanity's darkest night, a great Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, and a great Chief Rabbi, J.H. Hertz, came together in a momentous covenant of fate called the Council of Christians and Jews. And since then, Jews and Christians have done more to mend their relationship than any other two faiths on earth. And today we meet as beloved friends. And now we must extend that friendship more widely. We must renew the global covenant of faith, the covenant that began with Noah and reached its climax in the work of Joseph, the work of saving many lives. And friends, that's what we began to do last Thursday when we walked side by side, Christians and Jews and Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Jain and Zoroastrians and Baha'i. And yes, we don't share a faith, but we surely share a fate. Because whatever our faith or lack of faith, hunger still hurts, disease still strikes, poverty still disfigures, and hate still kills. And few put it better than that great Christian poet, John Donne, the perfect epitome of the covenant of fate. Every man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Friends, if you have a chance to look at Genesis chapter 50, you will see that just before he says the great words of reconciliation, the text says, Joseph wept. Why did Joseph weep? He wept for all the needless pain he and his brothers had caused one another. And shall we not weep when we see the immense challenges that humanity is being faced with in the 21st century? The challenge of poverty, of hunger, of disease, of environmental catastrophe. And what is the face religion has all too often shown to the world? The face of conflict between faiths, and sometimes within faiths. And we, Jews and Christians, who have worked so hard, so effectively at reconciliation and reached it, we must now take the lead in showing the world there is another way. The way of the covenant of fate, honoring humanity as God's image, protecting the environment as God's creation, respecting diversity as God's will, keeping the covenant as God's word. Friends, too long we have dwelt in the valley of tears. Let us walk together towards the mountain of the Lord, side by side, hand in hand, bound by a covenant of fate that has the power to turn strangers into friends. In an age of fear, let us be agents of hope. And together, let us be a blessing to the world. Thank you.
Bless you. Bless you.